let's have a look at vectors. Vectors are just a way of describing how to move from one position to another. So let's imagine that we're on the coordinate plane and we have two vectors. Let's say we have 3, 5, and then over here we'll have 12, 8. Okay? So a vector describes how to move from one position to another. So for example, we could go from here to there. Let's call this point A and this point B. So this green vector that we have here would be called the vector AB, and we would describe how far we've moved across. So that would be 9 across, and how far we've moved up. So that would be 3 up. And we can represent that as a vector, similar to a coordinate, but when we write it vertically, it's describing a movement. Okay? So we have our vector AB. There's an alternative notation for this. We could also write it as AB, and we could say that that is 9 lots of I plus 3 lots of J. I and J are what we call unit vectors. I describes one movement to the right. So in terms of coordinate geometry, that's like moving 1 along the x-axis. So that is the vector 1, 0. Okay, 1, 0 is I. We also have the unit vector J, which is 0, 1, and that describes 1 unit up. We underline stuff which is a vector. Okay, so we've got two ways of writing the vector 9, 3 as a vector like that in column form, or 9i plus 3j. Okay, one thing we need to be careful of with vectors is that they do have a direction. When we do mechanics, you'll see that some of our quantities are vector quantities, others are scalar. So we have the vector here AB. We could also have the vector BA. That would be travelling from B to A. So in that case, we would be subtracting 9 and then subtracting 3 to move this way. And that would have, in I and J form, minus 9i minus 3j. So vectors are direction dependent. As long as we know the length of the vector and its direction, we fully know what that vector is. So how do we find the length of a vector? Just the same as when we was doing coordinate geometry before. We form right angle triangles. I and J are perpendicular to each other. We have horizontal and vertical, so we just use Pythagoras' theorem. So BA, we can either write it like this with no arrow across it, or alternatively, let's do AB in green, let's be consistent. Or alternatively, we can put these vertical lines around it. That's what we call the magnitude of the vector, or its length. Just Pythagoras' theorem, 9 squared plus 3 squared. That's going to give us 81 plus 9, root 90, or 3 root 10. Okay, so we've got our definition of a vector. It describes how to go from one place to another. It can be written in two different forms, vector or I and J form. And once we know its direction, we can also work out its length. We write that as the magnitude of the vector, and then we just use Pythagoras to do that. That's our basic introduction to vectors.